I shouldn't have been touching Preston's collarbone in the dim, stale light of his den, especially since his daughter, Juno, my best friend, was asleep just one floor above us. My fingers traced the deep indent where his shirt was unbuttoned, a reckless movement I knew I couldn't take back. He didn't flinch. Instead, he simply leaned into my touch, his eyes dark, reflecting the heavy realization that we had crossed a line he'd sworn we could manage. That line was supposed to protect us, but now, standing so close, I finally understood. The danger wasn't the crossing. It was how desperately I wanted to stay on the other side with him. My life in Oakwood was predictable, functional, and quiet. I worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized tech startup downtown, a job that paid the bills and demanded just enough attention to keep the silence at bay. My name is Alara, and at 24, I felt like a fully furnished, well-maintained apartment that nobody ever bothered to rent. My routines were sacred. Tuesday nights, I made lentil soup and watched old black and white films. Friday nights, I did laundry and read a heavy, intellectually satisfying novel. There was no drama, because I had meticulously engineered the absence of anything that could lead to it. I had moved back to Oakwood 3 years ago, right after college, mostly to be closer to Juno. She was my anchor, the one person who saw past the polite facade and knew that sometimes the quiet routine was just a clever disguise for loneliness. I rented a small carriage house behind the main residence owned by the Sterling family, which was how I became Preston Sterling's tenant, and indirectly, his peripheral observer. My rent was paid on time, my garbage cans were out every Wednesday morning, and I kept my distance. It was the perfect arrangement for someone who needed structure, not chaos. That particular evening, a damp, cold Thursday in late October, was supposed to be unremarkable. I was microwaving leftover pasta, standing by the counter in my oversized Yale sweatshirt, listening to the muffled sounds of life coming from the main house. Juno was likely upstairs, wrestling with her organic chemistry textbook, or on a chaotic video call with her boyfriend, Elias, a name I instinctively flinch from, a habit I haven't quite managed to break. And Preston, I assumed, was exactly where he usually was at 7:30 p.m., locked in his home office, dealing with the ceaseless demands of Sterling Dynamics, the architectural firm he'd built from the ground up. He was always working, always driven, always slightly removed. I knew the layout of his life almost as well as I knew mine, not because I was nosy, but because our proximity meant I often saw small vignettes through the large bay windows. A hurried phone call, a late-night shadow moving behind the blinds, the brief, weary slump of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. He was nearly 50, widowed for 5 years, and carried the weight of both a major company and a bright, demanding daughter on his broad frame. To me, he was a mountain, imposing, stable, and utterly impossible to scale. My own emotional expectations were set so low they were practically subterranean. I didn't wait for magic or grand gestures. I waited for the microwave to beep, for the pasta to be warm, and for the next episode of my historical documentary to begin. The most extraordinary thing I expected tonight was perhaps a text from Juno, asking if I wanted to share a pint of ice cream. It was a life I had made safe, a life where nothing unpredictable, nothing dangerous, and certainly nothing thrilling could ever touch me. I ate the pasta standing up, savoring the quiet mediocrity of it all. It felt like the only way to protect myself from ever needing something more. The calm safety of my Thursday night dissolved with the sudden, insistent vibration of my phone on the kitchen counter. It wasn't Juno. It was Preston. I stared at the name, a little knot forming in my stomach. He almost never texted me directly. All logistical communication, rent, landscaping, repairs, was usually handled through his estate manager or Juno herself. My heart gave a surprised, fast thump that felt disproportionate to the event. The text was brief and entirely mundane. Alara, sorry to bother you. Do you happen to have a spare 9V battery? My smoke detector in the upstairs hallway is signaling low battery and I can't reach the ladder in the garage right now. completely stuck on a call. Thanks, P. It was such a trivial request, so typical of the small domestic emergencies that disrupt suburban life. I sighed, mostly at the interruption to my documentary, but also because it meant I had to step out of my self-imposed isolation and into his orbit. I rummaged through the junk drawer. Of course I had one. I was the kind of person who always had spare batteries, just in case the quiet life decided to demand a brief, functional connection to the outside world. I pulled on a light jacket over my sweatshirt and headed across the damp lawn towards the back entrance of the main house. The light was on in Preston's study, a sharp yellow beacon against the encroaching twilight. I hesitated by the back door, knowing that this simple act of lending a battery was purely transactional. I was doing a neighborly favor for my best friend's father and my landlord. There was no risk, no emotion, and definitely no potential for anything more. It was just a battery. I tapped lightly on the door, expecting to leave the small rectangular box on the kitchen counter and retreat immediately. The door opened almost instantly, but it wasn't Juno who answered. It was Preston. He looked exactly like a CEO pulled abruptly away from a crisis. Tie loosened, a wrinkle between his eyebrows, and the kind of barely contained energy that makes a room feel smaller. His eyes, though, were what always caught me, a clear, intense shade of gray that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. "Ilara, thank you. You're a lifesaver," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, the typical rhythm of his speech slightly hurried. He stepped back, gesturing for me to come in. "Juno is asleep upstairs. I was trying to manage this awful chirping while running a budget review. It's driving me insane." I handed him the battery, my movements swift and efficient, ready to bolt. "No problem at all, Preston. Glad I could help." I waited for the dismissal, the quick nod, the closing door. But it didn't come. He just stood there, the battery warm in his palm, studying me with a focused intensity that made the stale air between us thick. "Stay a moment," he requested, not with authority, but with a surprising softness. I was just about to make a coffee. "Decaf, don't worry. Unless... Do you have time? I haven't actually spoken to a human being outside of a conference call today." It was a casual, almost pathetic plea for company, delivered by a man who was normally surrounded by people eager for his attention. My impulse was to politely decline and return to the safety of my couch. But the unexpected vulnerability in his eyes, the exhaustion under the surface of the powerful man, made me hesitate. It was just a coffee. Nothing to do with destiny, just circumstantial politeness. The Sterling kitchen was immaculate, stainless steel gleaming under the recessed lighting. It smelled faintly of expensive soap and now brewing coffee. I stood awkwardly by the island, watching Preston move through the space he commanded. He wasn't just a powerful man in a suit. He was the head of the house, the authority figure, the father of my best friend. That asymmetry of roles was a heavy, silent presence in the room. Preston Sterling was not merely handsome. He possessed an undeniable, quiet magnetism born of confidence and control. At 49, the silver at his temples wasn't a sign of aging. It was a testament to experience. He moved with a precision that suggested he measured every step, every word. Even the simple act of pouring water into the coffee machine felt significant. He was a detail-oriented architect who saw the structural integrity of everything, including social boundaries. I kept my gaze fixed on the steam rising from the mugs. This wasn't my space. He existed in a different stratum, one of board meetings, high-stakes decisions, and a level of responsibility I couldn't fathom. I was the friendly neighbor, the helpful tenant, the peripheral college friend of his daughter. We occupied mutually exclusive orbits, held together by Juno and a lease agreement. "Cream or black, Ilara?" he asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the machine. "Just a splash of milk, thank you," I replied, my voice sounding unnecessarily small in the vast room. He handed me the mug, his fingers brushing the ceramic near the handle. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a tiny, sharp shock through my hand. I pulled back instantly, perhaps too quickly. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he ignored it with the masterful neutrality of a man accustomed to masking his internal state. We settled at the large kitchen island. He leaned his elbows on the marble, looking less like the CEO of a major firm and more like a tired man who just wanted 5 minutes of peace. I noticed the faint, dark circles under his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he lifted the heavy ceramic mug. He was tired, profoundly tired. "Thanks again for the battery," he said, taking a slow sip. "It's the little things that break you, isn't it? Not the multi-million-dollar deals, but the incessant beep of a dying battery." He offered a small, dry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's always the microaggressions of home maintenance," I agreed, trying to keep my tone light and entirely impersonal. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was substantial. It was the kind of silence that usually exists between two people who know they have nothing meaningful to say to each other, yet are forced to coexist for a moment. But then, he did something unexpected. He looked directly at me, not with the polite acknowledgement of a host, but with the specific, focused attention of someone reviewing an important blueprint. "Juno tells me you're thriving at the tech company," he said. "Are you happy there, Alara? Truly happy?" The question felt too probing, too intimate for a landlord-tenant father-best-friend exchange. It demanded an honest answer, something I rarely offered to anyone, especially not to the man who represented everything I was currently keeping outside my carefully constructed life. Preston's directness always threw me off balance. Most people ask, "How are you?" expecting fine. He asked about happiness, demanding a real inventory of my soul. I fiddled with the rim of my mug, avoiding his heavy, intelligent gaze. "I'm functional," I said finally. The word sounded lame, but it was the most accurate description of my life. The work is steady. The team is great. It's safe. He didn't respond immediately. He just watched me, a small, knowing curve forming at the corner of his mouth. It was the look of an architect who could immediately spot a flaw in the foundation, even when the facade looked perfectly fine. The silence stretched, and suddenly, the kitchen that moments ago felt merely formal now felt intensely charged. Was he judging my lack of ambition? My choice of comfort over challenge? "Safety is overrated, Alara," he finally murmured, the coffee cup now resting untouched on the marble. His eyes were locked on mine, and this time, the look lasted maybe 3 seconds too long. It was the kind of sustained, focused attention that stripped away my invisibility. My cheeks felt warm, and I could feel a nervous tremor starting in my chest. "Stop it, Alara." I chastised myself internally. He's just making conversation. He's tired. He's alone. And you're the only person who happened to be nearby. But the way he was looking at me, it wasn't paternal, and it certainly wasn't the distant look of a landlord. It was something else. Something I couldn't categorize without invoking a level of emotional risk I wasn't willing to take. It was a look that seemed to appreciate the specific geometry of my face, the nervousness in my posture, the entire ecosystem of my quiet existence. "It's the framework I prefer," I countered weakly, trying to steer the conversation back to professional detachment. "I like knowing what to expect. Chaos is expensive." "And what does that cost you?" he pressed, leaning slightly closer. His voice had dropped to a near whisper, and the intensity of his focus made it feel like we were sharing a secret in a crowded room. I felt a sudden, fierce urge to escape, to run back to the predictable comfort of my carriage house. Was he flirting with me? Impossible. This was Preston Sterling, the man I idealized as a fortress of control. He was Juno's father. That entire notion was a breach of contract, a violation of the unspoken terms of my residency here. I must be misinterpreting his kindness, his exhaustion, his simple desire for adult conversation. I was projecting my own quiet yearnings onto a tired man. I took a large gulp of coffee, nearly scalding my tongue. "It cost me the chance to burn out, I suppose," I said, trying to force a laugh that didn't quite materialize. He didn't laugh back. He simply held my gaze, and in that moment, the subtle energy that had been circulating between us solidified into an undeniable connection. It was uncomfortable, thrilling, and deeply wrong. I knew then that the battery wasn't the only thing I had delivered to the main house tonight. I had accidentally brought the possibility of disruption. Preston sighed, a deep, heavy sound that seemed to pull the weight off his shoulders for just a second. He finally broke eye contact, looking down at the pristine marble counter as if reading a confession written in the polished surface. This was the moment the CEO veneer cracked, and the tired human being underneath emerged. "I asked about happiness because I don't remember what it feels like to feel safe," he admitted, his voice low and utterly devoid of his usual command. "I designed this house. It's solid, reinforced concrete, insulated perfectly. But the moment I walk through the door, I realize the structure has nothing to do with what happens inside. I feel like I'm constantly standing on the edge of a great collapse." I was stunned into silence. This was not small talk. This was a naked, unvarnished glimpse into the interior of the fortress. I had always seen him as untouchable, immune to the petty anxieties of normal life. Now, he was telling me that his empire felt like a house of cards. "You look at me and you probably see success, security," he continued, glancing up quickly, catching my expression of pure shock. "And that's fine. That's the image I built. But after Clara, after my wife passed, everything I built felt hollow. I spend 12 hours a day making sure everyone else's foundations are solid. But I come home to a house that is too quiet, too large, and I realize I have no idea how to design a life for one." The raw honesty was disarming. It felt like being suddenly allowed into a highly restricted architectural vault. The power dynamic, which had been so rigid, him the powerful employer, me the peripheral subordinate, shifted dramatically. He was still the man who signed major contracts, but right now, he was also just a lonely widower, confessing his fears to a woman who was technically his tenant. "Juno is amazing. She's resilient, but she's growing up. She's gone most of the time," he whispered. "I worry I'm teaching her how to be a driven professional, but I have no idea how to teach her how to be happy, because I don't have the blueprint myself." He pushed a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that was profoundly human. I felt an unexpected, fierce wave of compassion wash over me. It completely overwhelmed the instinct for self-preservation. I realized his problem wasn't a lack of resources. It was a devastating lack of connection. He was rich, powerful, respected, and utterly isolated in his magnificent fortress. "You don't need a blueprint for happiness, Preston," I found myself saying, my voice soft but steady. "It's not something you design. It's something you stumble into, usually when you're not looking for it." He looked at me again, but this time, the intensity was different. It wasn't about judgment or control. It was about recognition. He saw that I understood the language of quiet solitude, the effort it takes to maintain a functional life when the interior is unstable. He saw me, Ilara, not Juno's friend, not the tenant, but someone who had also chosen safety because she was afraid of the risk. The coffee was cold, but the air in the kitchen was now warm, thick with the residue of his unexpected confession. We talked for the next hour, and it felt less like a conversation and more like an unintended therapy session for both of us. The setting, the bright, impersonal kitchen, felt suddenly intimate, a neutral zone where the rules of status and tenancy were suspended. We talked about architecture, surprisingly. Not about Sterling Dynamics' latest contract, but about the philosophical weight of designing spaces for human interaction. I confessed that my graphic design work often felt too ephemeral, while his buildings felt like solid, enduring declarations against chaos. But enduring declarations are heavy, Preston countered softly, tracing the rim of his mug. They're permanent. Sometimes I crave the ephemeral, the chance to just try something and discard it if it doesn't work, without structural consequence. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that felt strange on my face, like a bad typeface or an ugly color palette. He laughed, a rich, deep sound that startled me with its warmth. I realized it was the first time I had ever heard Preston Sterling laugh without reservation. It was a sound that made the room feel brighter, erasing the weary lines around his eyes. It wasn't just the words. It was the proximity, the shared energy. My focus was intensely centered on him, the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, the deliberate cadence of his voice, the way he occasionally used his hands to emphasize a point, broad, capable hands that I instinctively wanted to know more about. He didn't touch me again, not even accidentally, but his presence was a palpable weight. Every time I thought about leaving, he would introduce a new topic, or I would find myself leaning in to hear a quiet observation. There were long stretches of comfortable silence, the kind where you don't feel the need to fill the space, because the shared moment is enough. It was a profound connection, achieved through absolute honesty, untainted by the expectation of romance or future commitment. It was just two people acknowledging each other's hidden landscape. I should go, I finally said, glancing at the wall clock, realizing it was past 10 o'clock. My documentary was long over. Preston stood up, instantly regaining his imposing height. Thank you, Alara. Truly. I needed that. He didn't offer a polite handshake or a hug. Instead, he simply met my gaze, holding it just long enough for the truth of the last hour to settle between us. A shared, unspoken understanding that something real had occurred, something that defied the labels of neighbor or tenant. As I turned to walk toward the back door, he spoke, his voice quiet. Be careful with that safety, Alara. Don't build the walls so thick you can't hear the knocking. My heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He wasn't talking about my apartment. He was talking about me. I practically ran across the wet grass back to my carriage house, the cold air hitting my face, jarring me back to reality. Once inside, I leaned against the locked door, breathless. My hands were shaking. What had just happened? It was a simple conversation, a shared cup of coffee, and a moment of mutual vulnerability. Yet, it felt like I had just navigated a complex moral minefield. I pulled off my sweatshirt, pacing my small living room. This couldn't happen. I couldn't let this happen. Preston was Juno's father. Juno was my closest friend, my chosen family here in Oakwood. Any disruption to the careful stability of our ecosystem would be catastrophic. The moment I allowed myself to acknowledge the magnetic pull I felt toward Preston, I risked everything. My friendship, my housing, and my peace. The taboo proximity was suffocating. I replayed his words in my head. Don't build the walls so thick you can't hear the knocking. I knew exactly what he was implying, and the terrifying part was that my walls felt suddenly flimsy. I wasn't scared of Preston. I was scared of my reaction to him. I was scared of the dormant desire he had awakened, the craving for deep, unreserved connection that I thought I had buried beneath layers of routine and function. The age difference was significant, 25 years. The power differential was absolute. He was my landlord, a man in a position of authority and status. My logic screamed at me. This is an emotional trap, Alara. You're confusing kindness with chemistry, and pity with passion. I needed to restore the balance, to retreat immediately into my invisibility shield. I decided then and there that I would minimize contact. I would communicate only through text or via Juno. If I ran into him, I would keep the interaction brief, polite, and sterile. The thought of losing this fragile, newly found connection hurt surprisingly deeply, a sharp ache in the hollow part of my chest. But the alternative, the risk of hurting Juno, of becoming the awkward, impossible wedge in their family life, was unbearable. I needed distance. I needed the familiar safety of my quiet life. I looked out the window at the main house. The light in Preston's study was still on, a solitary square of yellow in the darkness. I imagined him there, reviewing blueprints, trying to reassert control over the professional world because the emotional one felt too messy. I felt the powerful urge to go back, to stand in the light with him and finish the conversation we started. But I forced myself to turn away. I had always been the responsible one, the one who tried to do the right thing, even when it hurt. And the right thing, in this impossible scenario, was to become invisible again. I had to protect the line, even if he had been the one to first suggest crossing it. I felt the cold comfort of self-denial settling over me, the heavy burden of my own containment. My attempts at self-imposed exile lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of meticulously avoiding the main house, sending Juno polite, vague texts, and leaving my garbage cans out 5 minutes earlier than usual. I felt like a spy in my own life, constantly checking for the all-clear. On Sunday afternoon, I was pulling weeds from the small flower bed outside my door, trying to channel my frantic energy into something productive and dirt-covered. I was bent over, gloved hands deep in the soil, when a shadow fell over me. I froze. I knew without looking up who it was. The air around him always felt heavier, more contained. Alara. Preston's voice was deep, soft, and completely level. I slowly straightened, trying to make my face a mask of casual neighborliness. I wiped a smudge of dirt from my cheek, feeling the absurdity of the situation. Me, dirty, and dressed in faded jeans, facing the impeccably dressed CEO on his Sunday. "Preston, everything all right?" I asked, keeping my tone crisp, professional, and distant. I was ready to pivot the conversation to the broken sprinkler head or the cost of lawn maintenance. He didn't mention the weeds, the rental agreement, or even Juno. He simply looked at me, his gray eyes unusually intense, and held my gaze until my carefully constructed defenses began to crumble like dry soil. "You've been avoiding me," he stated, not as a question, but as a known fact. "And I understand why. You're trying to build back the distance. You're trying to reestablish the line." My heart hammered so violently I thought he could surely hear it. I mumbled something about being busy with a project deadline, a transparent lie that didn't even convince me. He took a slow step closer, closing the last foot of space between us. He wasn't aggressive or demanding, but his sheer presence felt like a structural pressure on my chest. Then came the line that shattered everything. It wasn't a confession of love or an explicit invitation. It was simple, devastating, and entirely about recognition. "I know you think we're safe, Alara, because you're hiding, and I'm busy. But every night since Thursday, I keep looking over here, waiting for the light in your window to turn off. I have seen hundreds of people this week, negotiated complex deals, stood on stage, and I remember almost none of their faces. But I remember exactly how the light hit your eyes when you laughed in my kitchen. You are the only person who looks at me and sees the tired man, not the structure. I've been looking for you without knowing I was looking for anything at all. Stop trying to disappear. I won't let you." The power was completely reversed. He hadn't just seen my fear. He had named my desire for connection. He wasn't seducing me. He was choosing me, acknowledging me, demanding that I finally stop hiding. My throat was tight, choked with sudden, overwhelming emotion. All the rules, all the caution, all the sensible boundaries I had spent 3 days rebuilding, they all collapsed with the finality of a poorly constructed stage set. He had seen the truth of my invisible life, and he had claimed it. My response wasn't eloquent or dramatic. It was a raw admission of fear and a grudging acceptance of the inevitable. My hands, still covered in garden soil and latex gloves, were trembling. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Everything felt surreal, like a dream that was far too vivid to ignore. "You can't do this, Preston," I managed to whisper, my voice thick with emotion. "You can't just see me. We have too many walls around us. Walls you built, walls I respect. Juno, my entire setup here. It's too much to risk for a feeling." He didn't argue or try to diminish my concerns. He simply listened, his expression earnest and steady. He understood the scale of the risk better than I did. He was the one with the reputation, the empire, the daughter. "I know the risk, Alara," he said, his voice dropping slightly lower, closer to a private wavelength. "I am painfully aware of the fallout. But I've been living my life based on mitigating risk for too long, and I'm tired of being safe, if safe means being alone." He reached out a hand, his large fingers resting gently on my shoulder, not pulling me closer, but simply grounding me. The warmth of his touch was startling, the first physical connection that wasn't accidental. "I'm terrified," I admitted, the confession tumbling out before I could stop it. "I am terrified of what this means, of how much I want it to mean something. I've never been chosen. Not like this. And I'm Juno's friend, Preston. I keep running that through my head." "Juno is my first priority, always," he asserted, his eyes unwavering. "But this doesn't diminish her. It changes us. We are two adults who are finally deciding to be honest about what we feel. We will navigate the rest. We have to." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the terror and the undeniable pull fight it out. I knew I should say no. I should apologize for the intimacy of the moment, promise to maintain distance, and retreat to my safe, silent life. But his touch on my shoulder, his raw honesty, his powerful act of seeing me when I had worked so hard to be unseen, it was a lifeline I couldn't cut. I opened my eyes and looked at him. "I don't know what we're doing," I said, my voice barely a breath. "I don't know the first step, or the second, or if this is sustainable. But I'm tired of hiding too. I accept the risk. I won't disappear." It was an acceptance without condition, a choice based purely on the seismic emotional shift that had occurred between us. It wasn't about a future or a relationship status. It was just the decision to stop denying the current. Preston's expression softened, the tension in his jaw finally relaxing. He didn't smile, but the relief in his eyes was profound. He knew what a difficult thing I had just agreed to. Preston didn't say anything for a long moment, simply holding my gaze, solidifying the weight of the promise we had just made. Then, he gently removed his hand from my shoulder, shifting the focus away from the intensity of the confrontation. He motioned toward the large manicured yard, where the last light of the day painted the trees in muted gold. "Walk with me," he suggested, his voice now calm and steady, like a captain taking control of a ship after a storm. I pulled off the gardening gloves, tossed them onto the porch, and started walking beside him, past the flower beds and the fountain, toward the tall hedge that separated his property from the quiet, private road. We weren't discussing our future or making plans. We were just moving, side by side, acknowledging the profound shift in our gravitational alignment. The initial tremor of fear was replaced by a strange, quiet exhilaration. It wasn't the thrill of a secret, but the relief of truth. We talked about nothing important. The unexpected coolness of the evening, the recent election results for the city council, the ridiculous complexity of his firm's new project in downtown Oakwood. We were grounding the impossible connection in the mundane reality of the present. The silence that fell between us was different from the silence in the kitchen. That had been a silence of tension and hidden desire. This was a silence of shared knowledge and mutual acceptance. I noticed how easily our pace matched, how naturally I found myself leaning in when he spoke, how comfortable it felt to simply exist in his immediate space without feeling the need to retreat. As we reached the end of the property line, Preston stopped. He turned to face me, the massive, imposing house looming behind him, now less a symbol of his authority and more a reminder of his solitude. "We have to be deliberate, Alara," he said, the seriousness back in his eyes. "We don't get to be reckless with this. We walk the line slowly, and we tell the truth. Always." "I agree," I whispered. "Deliberate." He reached out and gently brushed the last smudge of dirt from my cheekbone, his touch lingering for a heartbeat too long. It was the softest gesture, yet it carried the weight of every boundary we had just agreed to dismantle. We stood there, at the edge of the known world, looking back at the safe lives we were choosing to risk. There were no grand pronouncements, no promises of forever. Just the undeniable sensation that a new, terrifying, and profoundly real chapter had just begun. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might actually be worth the read. If you felt that pull, that moment where the risk finally outweighed the fear, hit the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, if you were Alara, would you walk away to protect your safe, predictable life? Or would you risk the fire for a love that finally sees you?